Control of our government. Now before this bureaucratic, oversized, and self-serving federal government starves us of our property, our freedom, our rights, our liberty. But to do this, we must shed conventional thinking regarding our political structure. We need to be revolutionaries in thought, dissidents in action. Only after we recognize what our government is doing to our freedom and our Constitution will we start taking it back. And this program is just about that. Today, we're pleased and honored to have a returning guest, Dr. Dean Stansel. He's a research associate professor at Southern Methodist University's O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom. And today, we're going to discuss economic freedom indexes, and there's many of them. And if we have time, we're going to talk about the federal tax reform and health care. And with that, we will have solved all the problems of the world. Everything will be fine. Dr. Stansel, thank you very much for being on Liberty Talk Radio.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Well, I'm in a bad mood today. I'm looking forward to you putting me in a good mood because I just had a political discussion with a friend that made absolutely no sense, and I'm about ready to just jump out the 20. I tell you, good things these windows are sealed. I would have jumped a long time ago. But tell me something good. Give me some good news. I know the economic indexes. I follow them also. There's several. There's the Personal Freedom Index, there's a Business Freedom Index, and there's several. And I know the Cato Institute does a comprehensive one, which is usually 2 years by the time they compile it. So the last one I read was 2014 or 2015. And we keep on losing ground, but if you speak to the average American, they'll all tell you in the Freedom Index, America is number one. Little do they know, in some of them, we're number 28, number 17, and you name the index, and we seem to fall every single year. What say you?
Well, if you're in a bad mood, I'm afraid I'm not going to help much. Talking economic freedom.
All right, I'll put my gun away, okay? How about that?
Yeah, right. So we are, let's just talk about the U.S. as a whole. So there's one that the Fraser Institute does, and a colleague of mine here at the O'Neill Center, Bob Lawson, is one of the authors, and it's called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And so back in the year 2000, we were ranked right up there at the top where most Americans kind of more likely think we belong. We were behind Singapore and Hong Kong, but in terms of kind of the major industrialized countries, we were right there at the top. Since then, we've steadily declined. I believe last year's report, we were down to 16th place, and we were behind all sorts of countries you wouldn't think are more free than us. And again, it's been a steady decline under both a Republican president and a Democratic president. It's been a bipartisan effort through presidents and the Congress to take away our freedoms. And at the same time, by the way, Joe, even worse news is that what's coincided with this decline in economic freedom is a decline in economic growth, right? So we had a deep recession, but even ignoring the recession, since our economic freedom declined starting in 2000, the growth compared to the previous 20 years has been much slower. A colleague of mine and I had a chapter in the Economic Freedom Report where we looked at this. So, for example, our trend growth was nearly 4% in GDP from 1930 to 2000. Since then, it's below half that. It's only been about 2%. And that's just one example of how things have gotten so much slower. Business investment has gotten a lot slower in terms of its growth. And one of the reasons that's so important is that when businesses don't expand their investment and add new equipment and expand their businesses, well, that means productivity isn't going to grow. If productivity doesn't grow, standards of living don't grow, so we all become poorer. It all gets back to economic freedom and to what they're doing there in D.C. to take that away. So I'm afraid the news isn't good there. As you were talking about off air a little bit, listen, we a lot of us maybe came in with some expectations that this outsider would drain the swamp and granted it's early and bring in a new era of economic freedom. Certainly it hasn't happened yet. And I'm not real optimistic, quite frankly.
Well, he drained the swamp. The only problem is that he refilled it with sludge, and so we didn't go anywhere. I tell you, I voted Libertarian in the last presidential election. I'll be honest with you, that's what I did, right? But when it came down to Hillary versus Donald Trump, I was rooting for. In fact, this is the first time I actually stood up all night to watch the results. So it's not that I'm an anti-Trump person, and now that he's in office, I'm going to criticize everything he says, because I really was. He was my second choice, and I wasn't disappointed because I wanted to see a person other than a political person in office, as everyone else did. However, in doing so, I didn't want him to turncoat on us and become a politician. Now, what people, and I want you to comment on this, what people assumed is that you could run a country as you run a business. In fact, it's the exact antithesis of that. For example, if a person owns a company and they make bolts and screws, the owner of that company can come in the next day and says, okay, we're going to make ceramic plates. It's their company. They can do whatever they want. They can say we're going to expand or we're going to contract. We're going to close it down altogether, sell it. I'm going to go to the Bahamas and sit on the beach all my life. That's, if you own a business, that's your prerogative. You own the business. These people are being employed and getting paid. A country, when you run a country, it's the exact opposite. That's why we call the people in office the servants of the people. They serve the public. And nowhere during Donald Trump's campaign, and Hillary Clinton was the same, by the way, did we ever hear talk such as, serving the people, freedom of the people to act, deregulating so we can get a free enterprise system from the bottom up going again, re-energize. All we heard was, this is what I'm going to do as president, and as president, I'm going to do this, and that. As if there is no power to the people, there's only power vested in Washington. And that's the exact opposite of being a businessman. The exact opposite of being a politician versus a businessman. What say you on that?
Yeah, sure. You're exactly right. And it's all well and good to think, well, we should run government like a business. But the fact of the matter is that government is set up very differently. It's not set up anything like a business, which is the very reason why we should restrict it to only the bare necessities and leave as much to the private sector as possible. Think about the incentives that exist in a bureaucracy versus a private business. For example, in that business you talked about, if some employee came up with a way to lower costs and save the company money and increase their profits, everyone would celebrate. They'd maybe get a raise or some sort of a bonus. But think about what happens in a federal executive agency, for example. Let's say someone in the Department of Education comes up with a way to lower the cost and save money. What happens at the end of the budget year when they've got money left over? Well, of course, what doesn't happen is what happens is they find a way to spend it. But let's say they didn't. Let's say there's someone naive to Washington didn't know that it was bad to have money left over. They get to the end of the budget year. They have money left over. What happens in next year's budget? Well, the budget writers say, well, these education bureaucrats didn't need the money, so we're going to take that money from you and put it over here, right? So the incentives are exactly backwards. The incentives are not to reduce costs, but rather to run up costs so that you can get more money next year. And that's exactly why we need to get government out of the education business. That's just one example. Out of the energy business, right? We have a former governor here in Texas who, when he was running for president a couple of years back, said he wanted to get rid of a couple agencies. He forgot one of them, but one of them he wanted to get rid of was the Energy Department. Well, look at this. He's the Secretary of the Energy Department now. So I expect next thing you know, he's going to get rid of his own agency, right? Unfortunately, I don't think so. But yeah, there's lots of room for reduction, and ultimately, I think even things like the Education Department and the Energy Department, they're really not that old. They've been around maybe 3 or 4 decades. These aren't things that are written into the Constitution that are absolute necessities for government to do. They create a whole lot of problems, and we'd be better off getting rid of those things and sending the money back to the taxpayer through bigger tax cuts than they're talking about now.
Well, my favorite president was Calvin Coolidge. He, during the worst depression that this country ever experienced, in was that 1921? I think so, about 1920. I lost the year for a second, but during his time in office, he reduced the size of government during the worst, much worse than the 29 depression, if you look at the numbers. And he reduced the size of government by 50%, not 5 or 10%, 50%. He was a man of very few words, a lot of action. And he understood that the free enterprise system was the only way to get out of the depression. And it was the biggest fastest comeback this any country has ever experienced from being in a very, very deep depression. I mean, the line, if you look at the graph, the line is straight up after he enacted all these programs. We today do the exact opposite of what he did. And we just did. And what I find depressing is that so many of the things that Donald Trump has promised. For example, he didn't believe in getting involved in world conflicts. He says that's their problem. I applaud him for that. But yet we launched the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. We lobbed like 58 or whatever missiles on Syria, which he criticized, but we shouldn't have been in the first place. Now we have an armada going to Korea, and to me, he turncoated on nearly everything he ran on. And that what's depressing is that people who voted for him sort of justify it. They go, well, he's doing it for a reason. Let's give him a chance. What more do you want? And anyway, please get me out of this funk I'm in. I need some help.
It's somewhat amusing how I think it was last week Trump was interviewed about being the first 100 days and all that. And he was quoted as saying, yeah, this is a lot harder than I thought it would be. He thought it would be easier than his regular job. And similarly, I think it was his Treasury Secretary, after the healthcare reform bill got killed about a month or two ago, his Treasury Secretary came out and said, oh, well, we'll get tax reform. That'll be much easier. Keep in mind, we haven't reformed the tax code since 1986. I mean, it's been, over 30 years. And I think what amuses me is the naivety of these guys who maybe are accomplished business people, but have come into politics and really don't know what the hell they're doing, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I don't follow politics, and I don't follow what Congress is doing, and so I speak somewhat from a great deal of ignorance. But Congress, a couple of years ago, presented to the then President Barack Obama a bill to do away with Obamacare. Not replace it, do away with it, all right? Now, they did that, in my opinion, because they knew he would reject it, and then they can say, well, we tried to do away with Obamacare and privatize part of the health care system, but Obama, vetoed it. But when Trump was in office, they didn't send that same bill to Trump. They sent a bill to replace Obamacare, knowing that there's not a snowball chance in hell that they were going to rewrite the entire Obamacare package to suit their particular ideology. That was a losing cause, and it's still a losing cause. And so, to me, they all say one thing, they do another. It's awfully easy. Trump was given the budget. We obviously hit the ceiling, and the government should have been shut down. What did he do? He raised it. Wait a minute. You buy a new company, you buy a company that's mired in debt. The last thing you do is go out and get more debt. Now, I know I'm losing my mind. I'm rambling on because I'm really aggravated. Please help me.
Oh boy. So listen, I think that, again, I agree with you. Unfortunately, I don't have good rosy scenarios for you. I think that this guy is in over his head to a certain extent, but really what it gets down to, some of the stories you were telling just a minute ago about the healthcare bill and all this, is that ultimately politics is a game, right? It's a game and involves compromise, but ultimately the American people, everyday folks listening to your radio show and other shows like it, don't take the time, because it doesn't make sense to. Don't take the time to really become informed on the issues, and don't really pay attention because they feel like there's nothing they could do anyway. So that's what makes shows like yours so important, helping the American public kind of understand the issues and see different sides of what's going on in Congress, in their own state legislatures, and that sort of thing. We need to get more awareness, more knowledge of good public policy, and that's why your show's, to me, so important. The thing about this spending issue is that so the president comes in with this new vision and all this. He's going to shake things up. Well, the first thing he does is propose increased spending on infrastructure, increased spending on defense, no offsetting cuts, and a big tax cut. Now, I'm all in favor of the tax cut. I think it should be bigger, but at the same time, you got to balance it out with some spending reductions. Get rid of some things, make some changes. Go for the low-hanging fruit like the Export-Import Bank. Instead of defending it, go out there and get rid of it. There's so much that could be done, and there's so many groups, think tanks in Washington that do good work, put together lists of programs to cut. That you just grab the list and say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. And it's confounding that there hasn't been more progress. It is early still, but ultimately, I think the fact that voters got so enamored with Trump is a good sign in some ways. Now he's full of bad policy prescriptions, no doubt, but it's a good sign in the following way, that people are frustrated with Washington business as usual and they want to shake things up. Now he hasn't done that, but I think it shows that the public has reached a point where we actually go to choose a candidate who was the least popular candidate ever, except for his opponent, right. Hillary Clinton. And so, it's we live in interesting times, and I really hope that these next couple of years we'll see some reforms, we'll see some grassroots movements to try to follow through on some of the freedom-enhancing policies that Trump was at least talking about some of the time.
Yeah. Now, the way I'm talking, you think I'm a Hillary Clinton fan, or as Gerald Salente, my paisan from Hone Avenue in the Bronx, would say, Hillary Clinton, and no, I think if it was a gun to my head, I'd say shoot. I couldn't do that, So I'm not justifying her losing it. I'm just saying that what he's saying he's not doing, and I'm so sick and tired of people who voted for Trump keep on saying, but he's a successful businessman. That's what we need in office. Now, I'm a bit much smaller in scope. I'm a successful businessman. I've never filed bankruptcy. I've never done any of those things. Been married for a long time, got 3 boys, the whole ball of wax, not everything went rosy and not everything is perfect and all that, but I muddled through it and we always work things out. Here's a guy who's been through 6 bankruptcies and 3 marriages. I wouldn't say that's a very successful record, And I go, wait a minute, he's not successful. Successful means that you solve your problems and you stick with them, unless there's extenuating circumstances that you cannot get around at all. And I said, I can't believe that this happened to him. Basically, he's got he's got nine tries so far, okay? And I said, so far he hasn't been successful in any one of them. What say you about that?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm not really enamored of President Trump's business acumen, but I don't have a lot of expertise there of my own. But ultimately, I think that having someone with outside experience is probably a good thing in the big picture. It's funny. There's another high-profile businessman with a reality show who lives here in Dallas named Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks and other things. He apparently is, last I heard, mulling getting involved in politics in some way, and that would be interesting to see if we're going to go down the road with a bunch of businessmen presidents in a row. I'm not sure that would happen, but I think he might do a somewhat better job than Trump. It's hard to say.
Yeah, well, Mark Cuban is one of the most successful business people in America. I mean, he's proven. Right. He's a multi-billionaire, But what bothers me, he have a multi-billionaire, and he's voting for and promoting Hillary Clinton. I may go, wait a minute, what happened to your brains? Did you lose them or something? I mean, I don't find much consistency. I like consistency in thought. I don't mind if you have a particular ideology, but be consistent and then explain to me why I'm thinking differently. Don't just go out your own way and say, well, that's the way it is. And that's what all these clowns do. And they really bother me. And I watch Shark Tank. I'm sort of more like Mr. Wonderful. I'm always right. And I do watch Shark Tank. And I enjoy that program.
Yeah, I confess I don't know much about Mark Cuban's views, but anyhow, it's good to get some outside influence there. Yeah. We'll see where that goes. But ultimately, things like this tax reform package are. It's amazing how something so relatively simple is so hard to get done. And we have the highest corporate income tax rate in the world. And a couple of years ago, there was big controversies about these corporate inversions with corporations in the U.S. pulling up stakes and moving their headquarters overseas, in part for tax purposes. And one of the best things we can do to reverse that tide is basically get rid of the corporate income tax. But if we can't get rid of it, at least reduce the rate as the president has proposed, and that would go a long way towards making us more competitive on that sort of thing. And ultimately, Joe, when you look at the amount of revenue that the corporate income tax brings in, it's really not very much. It's a very small portion of the budget compared to the individual income tax. And actually, most people pay more in the payroll tax than the income tax. So I believe we could get rid of it with some spending cuts and have no impact on the debt. But it's the spending cuts that are the hard part. These guys, it goes back to incentives again. Where's the incentive for an individual politician to say, I'm going to cut spending? Anytime you cut spending, there's a loser, right? And those losers have lobbyists and interest groups and that are going to go out there and run a commercial against you, and so you will no longer be a politician, right? It creates quite a catch-22. They did something back in the 80s, I think it was, with the base reduction or the base closure committee. So they wanted to cut back the number of military bases across the country, across the world, and they faced the common political problem in Congress that no one wants their own base in their district to go away, right? Because there's jobs and all that related to it. So they set up this committee where they would put forth a list, and it would only, by rule, be an up or down vote. So Congress couldn't get in there and start log rolling and vote trading. And it actually worked to save us some money way back whenever that was. But that sort of approach, I think, can work for a lot of other things, too, where you can lump together things like the Export-Import Bank and other such, cotton subsidies, all sorts of programs that have really targeted beneficiaries. But really, if you lump them all together, then everybody's ox is getting gored, and you got a better chance of scaling back the size of government, which is ultimately what it's all about. Federal spending has doubled since 2000 and has tripled since 1990, and incomes certainly haven't doubled and tripled since then.
Yeah. Well, here's a current issue. We developed ethanol supposedly because the reason it was given to us is because we're running out of oil at the time, and now we're going to use ethanol to supplement gasoline, so we would not be reliant on overseas oil, which was a stupid reason to start off with, But now we have, with fracking and all that, we have a glut of oil, and the only reason why we import is because we don't have the pipelines going all to the right places, and it is cheaper and more expeditious for us to import the oil than to transfer it over land, basically, to some parts of the United States. So we have more than enough oil, and then we can export oil to certain other locations, so it's a wash. Why do we need ethanol? Ethanol and I think Fidel Castro was right. He said ethanol starves people around the world, and that's exactly what it did. And yet, the reason why we have it, it's not good for the engines, right? It doesn't do a darn thing for pollution. Our miles per gallon on cars are approaching or exceeding 40 miles per gallon. And mileage is down. Cars are smaller and more efficient. There's no reason for that. But yet we persist on subsidizing ethanol, which is destroying our crops, destroying our export of corn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and yet it never goes away, and it's a cost to the consumer. What say you?
Yeah, sure. And it's funny how one of the main motivations for the ethanol subsidies was that the environmentalists thought it would be better for the environment. Now, they've changed their minds with newer research, but ultimately that was one of the big reasons why we went down that road. Also, it was a great benefit to the corn farmers in Iowa, where, of course, the caucuses are held every 4 years, and you've got to do well in Iowa. So no one wanted to be against it who wanted to run for president. It's done. It's also had the effect of raising the price of food, because with all this demand for corn syrup into the ethanol, then high fructose corn syrup and other sweeteners made from corn that are used for things like sodas, well, those become more expensive, right? Because you've got more demand for corn, and so the price of those things have gone up. And you look at some of the soda companies have switched back to what they used to use, regular sugar, right, in their sodas, natural sugar instead of the corn syrup, which in some ways is better for you anyway. But ultimately, it's a supply and demand thing, right? The demand for corn went way up, and it drove the price up, and then the consumer goods using it went up, and then we switched to sugar, which gets its own set of subsidies as well, a huge amount of subsidies there. There's a whole ball of wax there that we need to kind of start unwinding so that we can reduce the burden of government, have our economy be more free, have people able to rise up and have a good standard of living. Ultimately, there are a whole host of things we can do that really are fairly simple in some ways, just by getting government out of the way, right? It's not like come up with some plan with the best and the brightest of how we can manage the economy. I thought we learned the lesson back in the Cold War that managing the economy doesn't work. But we seem to have forgotten. It has been a while now.
Yeah, now we're the communist. We are basically a communist nation, let's be honest. I mean, we're running it. Washington runs everything. And let me go on record by saying I never buy ethanol fuel. I go out of my way. Now, if it's an emergency, I'm out of fuel and there's one service station and I'll fill up a couple of gallons to get to where I have to go. But I always buy 100% gasoline. No ethanol gasoline. I pay the extra amount, but it doesn't cost that much more because I get much better gas mileage that way. But it's my way of screwing the system. I mean, and I wish everyone would do that. Now, we can get rid of these ethanol subsidies if everyone did the same thing I did. Just say, screw you, Washington. We're going to buy regular gasoline. It's better for my car. It makes my car last longer. It gives me better gas mileage, and it's just as clean right now. And so I'm going to spend a couple of cents per gallon. If you average it out, it's only a few cents a gallon more. I can afford that, and that's my way of getting back to Washington.
Well, that's a great idea. How do you go about doing that? Because I'm unfamiliar. So are there particular gas stations that sell gas?
There are certain service stations that have a sign, no ethanol fuel. Here in Tulsa, there's a chain of service stations called Quick Trip, and I think they may be in Dallas. Quick Trip, in fact, the guy who started Quick Trip, Chester Cagiel, I was the Cub master for his son and my son at the same time when he was a small fry, and now he's one of America's most successful businessmen, but he passed away a few months ago. And he installed ethanol. All his new stations are ethanol, have no ethanol pumps, and he's converted some of the older stations, and as he converts them over, he's going to be, he's always going to give that option out. And I go out of my way to do it because it's my way of getting back to the system. I don't know what else to do.
No, that's a great idea. I honestly have just never noticed. I just put the pump in and turn it on, and never really noticed that I even had the option. So I'm going to look out for that next time.
Well, when you get old, decrepit, and mentally retarded like I am, after being a talk show host for so long, you can't stand it anymore. You do crazy things. That's one of the crazy things that I do. Now,
let's start a movement. Sounds good.
Well, I just wish that people would take it upon themselves to do something. Everyone should do something. We're lambs. I'm repeating myself for the 1,000th time, by the way. I could never watch a zombie movie. There's all sorts of zombie apocalypse and the Walking Dead and all this other stuff. And, I would sort of, if I was channel surfing, I'd watch it for maybe 30 seconds, but I never understood it. Why they're always dragging their right foot, and why is blood coming out of it? Why they want to eat somebody, I don't know. Never made any sense. And so I never watched a zombie movie from end to end, maybe 2 minutes just to see what was going on, just to change of pace. And then I turn it off. Until one day I realized why there are zombie movies. There are zombie movies because for the same reason there was that movie Idiocracy, where the people were crazy in the future, and whatever. And the same reason there was Star Wars and Avatar and so many, because they were all metaphors for the mentality of the American public and the abusiveness of government. They were all metaphors. Every single movie you see like that, and there's a few others I can't think off the top of my head. They were metaphors. Americans today are zombies. You bring up a subject, I tell you, I'd rather speak to someone from Europe. You speak to someone from Europe, they at least think, they're a little bit intellectual. They'll give you a good reason. Americans can't discuss anything whatsoever unless it's their favorite movie. And I think this is a problem. And this is how Trump got in office, by the way, my analysis.
Well, yeah, I mean, the politicians have made things more complicated than they need to be. If you think back to when Obamacare, that particular reform was passed, the Democratic leader in the Senate said, well, you have to pass it so that we can read it and see what's in it. I mean, the long, huge number of pages of this legislation, I mean, it's just impossible for a regular person who has a regular job to keep informed on the issues without giving up important things, time with their family and that sort of thing. And so it's a lot more complicated than it needs to be. And it's one of the big reasons why, why shows like yours are so important, because your listeners can get a chance kind of passively to hear other people talk about some of these issues and maybe shed some light on them without having to go search for the information themselves.
Yeah. Well, I would argue that people should not spend 1 minute on all these political issues. The reason being is that we have congressmen that represent the people. That's why their term is only 2 years. They're supposed to go there, fight for us, come home, and get back to work. But no, we have congressmen in there. Do you know we have more congressmen, 80 times the number of congressmen that have longer terms than the longest term justice of the Supreme Court? That's a lifetime job. And yet, 80 of them, 80 congressmen exceed the lifetime term of the longest serving Supreme Court judge. That's insane. Statistically, that's insane. So what we do is we have congressmen who are supposed to serve 2 years because they're supposed to keep their jobs and whatever, just go there, fight for us, come home, get back to work. They go there, they never come back. They become worse than the senators, worse than the vice president, worse than all of the cabinet members and all. Every one of them. And I don't see us getting any better. I see it getting worse. So what I see with all of this debt of eventual economic collapse, and then I don't know what we'll do.
Wow. All right. Well, but so you'd be a fan of term limits then, huh?
I'm sorry? I didn't think.
So you'd be a fan of term limits then? Term limits for Congress?
No, I'm a term. If they run for office for a second term, they should be hung.
That would probably do it.
Yeah, I mean, after 2 or 3 hangings, they'll get the. No, really, absolutely, one term only. Because what does a congressman do? He serves for 2 terms, but for that 2 terms, he only serves 1 year. Because 1 year he's campaigning.
Right.
So it's like every other year he sort of serves the people, meaning he serves himself because he has to make do with all the campaign contributions. It's the worst system in the world. There's no worse system in the world than our congressional system.
It is. So Senator George McGovern, I think it was back in the 70s when he retired from, I don't know if he got defeated or what happened, but he retired from politics and he decided to start up, I think it was a bed and breakfast in the Northeast somewhere. But anyways, he became essentially an entrepreneur, or tried to. And of course that business failed, like most new businesses do. But he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and this was a long time ago, probably shortly thereafter, maybe late 70s, early 80s, where he basically said, long story short, if I had known then, when I was a politician, what I know now as a failed businessman, I would have made, governed so differently. I would have made so many different decisions. That he had said he had no idea how the things that government does create such burdens to the success of businesses and entrepreneurs. And so your idea of one term and out would help with that, because these guys would have to live in the real world. They would have to live under the rules they're setting up. And that, to me, that would make a huge difference, and would help with better policies and fewer new policies.
Well, if in fact you can only run for 1 term and that's it, you don't go from to congressman to senator to vice president or whatever. You're in there 1 term, you're out. That means anyone who's interested in milking the system wouldn't be running. Only those people who want to do something for their district would run, because they know there's nothing for them other than their hard work. In fact, there'd probably be it'd probably be torture for them, so they must be doing it as a labor of love. And these are the people we want. And unfortunately, most of the people who run for office happen to be attorneys, a group of people we just love. We love attorneys. Attorneys would run everything. In fact, I wish my parish priest was an attorney. You know, I'd feel like I'm going to heaven. I mean, we have to be out of our minds. No, we're not out of our minds. We're zombies. We have no minds. What am I saying?
Sure. So, like you said, these guys get in there, and in order to get reelected, let's just presume good intentions, right? Let's presume that someone, a radical reformer, comes in and is able to get elected. Maybe they're a former businessman or something like that, so they've lived under the rules that the government creates, and they want to shake things up and reduce some of that burdensomeness. And they get in there in that system, and they find out, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to continue to make progress at pushing for the reforms that I care about so deeply, well, I need to get reelected, right? So that, like you said, year one, well, you basically need to start thinking about it another year down the road. I've got to get all this money raised, because sure enough, if I'm pushing radical reforms, there's going to be 1,000,000 30-second commercials against me saying how bad I am for the district. And ultimately, the incentives are not right for anyone to really do anything meaningful. And I notice in your background, I love the Constitution, that, I think what doesn't get enough attention is that the only reason that these interest groups and these corporations and lobbyists are giving money to these candidates is because the Constitution has been emasculated so that government can actually give them special benefits. If you look back at the Constitution, I think it's Article 1, Section 8, I may have that wrong, the General Welfare Clause, where it basically says, look, government should be able to provide for the general welfare. Well, if you read the Federalist Papers and the arguments at the time, what they meant by general welfare was not food stamps. What they meant was general, meaning applying generally to everyone, not specifically to cotton growers or peach farmers or what have you. And so all of that got kind of the Pandora's box was opened, and then you have all these opportunities for essentially these businesses and special interest groups to feed at the trough. And if we would close the trough, close the box back up, which of course is real hard to do, then a lot of this stuff would go away. You wouldn't have any reason to lobby Congress, because Congress couldn't do anything for you. And it really comes back to the Constitution, and unfortunately that means the answers aren't really easy.
Yeah. Well, here's a test. Ask an average American, a zombie, okay, a real zombie. Ask them, well, did you vote for Trump? If they say yes, they say, well, if in fact the economy gets back on track and inflation is under control and workers' salaries go up, productivity goes up, would you credit Obama with that? They say, with Trump, with that progress. They said, oh, absolutely. That's what he's there for. He's a businessman. Yes. I said, okay, now, here's an opposite scenario. Let's say things go downhill. Things get worse than they were before. We lose jobs. Our currency becomes inflated. Our incomes are down relative to what we can buy. We have inflation. Would you blame Trump? Now, I've asked this question several times of several zombies, okay, American citizens, and every single one of them says, oh, no, that wouldn't be his fault. You see what I mean? You can't win. You can't win no matter what you do. No one wants to think. You know why? Because when zombies think, it hurts. I think that's where the blood comes out. Every time they think, their blood comes out of their mouth because their brains explode.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, ideally, government would be there to do the bare necessities, to provide police, courts, defense, and the zombies you talk about wouldn't have to think about it. It wouldn't matter, because there was really nothing but kind of a night watchman state where we're having government do the things that it's hard to do privately, not impossible, but hard to do privately, and leave all this other stuff aside, like having government involved in education. Why on earth do we do that? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make things better. It makes things worse. In the whole list, mass transit, housing, all these things that the private sector can provide, but yet here we have whole agencies and set up in Washington meddling in these areas and making things harder, not easier.
People don't realize that everyone should watch the film of the New York City subway being built back at the turn of the 1900s. That entire thing, I mean, they went down 50 feet in bedrock using picks and shovels. on Fifth Avenue. I mean, major avenues where people walking down sidewalks, not even a gate, you could fall over, you die. I mean, it's an incredible, of course, black and white. It's an old movie. I watched this thing myself. It was the most remarkable thing. But people don't realize that was all done with private money. The city and the government had nothing to do with it. In fact, there wasn't any laws against it because, anyone did what they wanted. And yet, it turned out to be the seventh wonder of the world. Today, they want to lay track from point A to point B, maybe 20 miles. It costs billions of dollars, and it's never a success. And then everyone's taxed on it for the rest of their lives. Can't people see that the government doesn't work? The government just screws things up. And yet we could persist on doing that. But I want to get off of that because I'm getting hoarse. I'm just too upset right now. How about we talk about where do you think health care reform is going? Where do you see this thing? How is it going to progress?
Well, I can't really predict politically how it's going to progress, but I know what I think should happen. And actually, there was an article I read a while back about a company in Oklahoma, somewhere, I don't know which city, where basically, rewind a little bit. So part of the problem is what we call the third-party payer problem. And,
right.
We are basically have prepaid health care, not health insurance, because after all, insurance is a thing set up to help mitigate risk. Things like an annual physical or a sick visit when you have a cold, these things aren't really things you need risk to protect you against. What we need to protect against is kind of catastrophic illness and things of that nature that'll bankrupt you. But we don't use health insurance that way. It would be like using car insurance to pay for your oil change or your tires, right? It creates a system in which the consumer is not conscious of costs. And even if they wanted to find out how much routine healthcare expenses cost, they'd have a real hard time doing it. And so this article was about a new, and there's a lot of these out there, a growing number of these, a new medical care provider in Oklahoma somewhere that doesn't take insurance and that posts their prices on their website so consumers can see exactly what it's going to cost. And then consumers, basically, I think the way it usually works, consumers then can file on their own. But it saves the provider a whole lot of costs in terms of all the army of employees you have to have otherwise to deal with the bureaucratic paperwork with insurance. And it's the wave of the future, I think, and I think it will help slow the increase in healthcare costs because if you look at things like, for example, LASIK surgery for eyes, most health insurance doesn't cover that. And what's happened to the price of that over the years is it's declined quite dramatically. Right. Same thing with other things not covered by insurance, like cosmetic surgery, that sort of thing. Those prices tend to decline because consumers are spending their own dollars, right? And they're putting their own money at risk. So I think we need to get back to a consumer-driven industry somehow. Now there are ways to go about it with the tax credits and that sort of thing. But another factor is the way that individuals' health care is linked directly with their employer. Now that actually came about, by the way, I don't know if you know the history on this. In part, this is one of Milton Friedman's right. most regrettable moments, right? So back in I guess it was during World War II, when they put in wage and price controls to restrict the growth of prices for consumers. Well, that meant that employers couldn't raise wages to attract new workers. So what they did was they said, well, we'll start offering benefits, start offering health care benefits. And then the war ended, wage and price controls went away, but that was kind of already embedded in the system. Next thing you know, it's in the tax code. The businesses can write it off. And that's why we have this. And the Milton Friedman angle was he was at the Department of Treasury at the time, and they were no, I have that wrong. No, Milton Friedman was the withholding. All right, so yeah, we can't blame him for this one. I love Milton Friedman, by the way. But yeah, so it got embedded in the tax code, and it really, if you look at what happened, I know there were a lot of people when I lived in Florida during the last recession, and there were a lot of out of work construction workers and that sort of thing who basically were stuck because their spouse had health insurance, and if they tried to move, then they'd have trouble getting health insurance, and that sort of thing restricts people's mobility, and it restricts the ability to find a new job and improve your situation, and so that'd be another way we could go about improving the system, and and by the way, allowing these insurers to compete across state lines would be another big thing that would improve the system we have now.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left. I'm sure enough people, after listening to me rant, probably committed suicide, so we lost probably a good portion of our audience. But where do you see us going? I mean, to me, it's so bleak. I don't see any path that we are taking that is going to make things better. But there's got to be an end game. I was in a meeting, a business meeting, and I passed out a sheet to everyone. It said 7 steps of an empire, where it starts off and then it gets down to eventually collapse, step number 7, and, large armies, foreign involvements, bankrupt treasury, debasement of the currency, all that stuff, this is historical, goes back to the Phoenician time, 6,000 years of history. But of course, everyone disagreed with me. 6,000 years of history didn't mean a damn thing to these clowns. Anyway, but we are an empire. We're on the later stages somewhere when our currency is devaluing, and our wars are increasing and whatever. Where do you see us going? And give me your wild guesstimation of a timetable.
Well, I think this is a great chance to segue back to a more optimistic discussion of one of the things you mentioned at the outset, these freedom indexes. So sure, the U.S. is declining and all that, but there's another one that I work directly with called Economic Freedom of North America, where we rank the states.
Oh, okay,
well, the experience across states is quite different. So if you look at just look at the 4 largest states in the U.S., perhaps not surprisingly, New York and California are actually at the very bottom, 49th and 50th, or 50th and 49th, by the way. And Texas and Florida are right up there at the top. And you have very different economic experiences there as well. Population in Texas and Florida has grown more than 2.5 times faster in recent years than in New York and Texas. Income's grown much faster in those 2 states. We have kind of these laboratories of democracy here in the U.S. that offer perhaps some hope or optimism if we could get those folks up in D.C. to follow the example of states like Texas and Florida. And Oklahoma's right up there on the list, too, in terms of ranking on economic freedom. And so there's hope for optimism that we can scale back the size of government and get at things like occupational licensing, which tend to make it really hard for low-skilled workers to change careers. There are costly exams and classes you have to go through and fees you have to pay.
Wait, are you telling me my barber shouldn't spend $27,000 to go to a cosmetology school to learn to cut my beautiful locks? Are you suggesting that they may screw up and maybe not make it short enough? How dare you? What about my beauty? I mean, I'm a public figure. I got to look beautiful. $27,000 is a a low price to pay to cut my hair. That's how important I am.
I'm sure they're chomping at the bits to have the privilege, but no, you're right. That makes it harder for what is essentially a fairly low risk consumer service, right? I mean, it's not like you're going to die from a bad haircut. And things like in Florida where I live, there was interior designers had to get a license because everyone knows you could die if they give you the wrong paint color suggestion, right? And florists had to get license so that you would not choose the bad combination of flowers that might make someone sad. It's just it's remarkable, and actually that towards the end of the Obama administration, they actually put out a report where they cited this Institute for Justice work where they ranked the states. IJ.org is a great group in D.C. And they ranked the states, and they cited some of that. So there was some awareness on the left of maybe we need to do something here. And I think that certainly Trump has talked about deregulation and talked a good game at least about cutting back regulations, including things like this. So I think there's some hope that we can make some steps in the right direction in the next 4 years or so. And then take it from there. We'll see what happens in 2020, I guess.
Hopefully I'll be alive. I'm not sure. The way I'm going right now, it doesn't look very good.
As long as you choose the right barber, you should be okay.
Yeah, we'll be okay. All right, Dean, we're just about at the witching hour. Let me give you the last couple minutes to wrap things up, or even touch on another subject if you'd like before we close out.
Sure. So I guess the one thing that we had mentioned we might talk about was the minimum wage. So maybe we could just close out briefly on the minimum wage. Listen, the minimum wage essentially prices low-skilled workers out of the market, right? So there are, and it's one of these examples of kind of the seen and the unseen. It's easy to see the beneficiaries when cities or states raise their minimum wages because the people who are still around and employed get this bigger paycheck. but it's harder to see the worker who did not get hired because the company did not expand. And not only did they not expand, but instead maybe they automated, right? So increasingly you go to a fast food restaurant, for example, and you find a kiosk of some sort instead of a worker, right? You go and fill your own drink instead of them filling and giving it to you. Now that's, right. I'm not complaining about that. That's not a bad thing, but that means one less right. worker each time who would have a kind of a relatively low-skilled occupation, who would have a job learning the responsibility of working and showing up and doing a good job. And also the grocery store, right? You check out yourself if you want to, so they have to hire fewer checkout clerks, and so there are more lost jobs. It's hard to point to those people because we don't know who they would have been. But there are losers from increasing or even having a minimum wage at all. In my view, you ought to not have a minimum wage, period. What we ought to do is get rid of some of these restrictions on occupational licensing and other things that makes it easier for these folks, rather than giving a minimum wage hike largely, by the way, to people in wealthy families, right? A lot of these minimum wage workers are high school or college age workers in middle class, upper class families who don't really need the increase. So we're using a really blunt tool to try to help those with low skilled and low income when we could do that in much, much better ways.
Yeah, well, the minimum wage is an intrusion on someone's personal liberty. The government needs to get out of our personal liberty. Get away. Don't touch us. Let us do what we want. One of my first jobs in high school, I begged the person to hire me. He said, I can't afford you. I said, I don't want to get paid. I want to work here. I want to learn. And he hired me, no pay. Now, if someone would have found that, I'm sure he would have gone to jail, but I begged him to. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And he used to give me a few bucks to go out Saturday night on a date or something like that. And it worked out perfectly. For several months out of high school, I used to run over there and used to take the subway over there. Used to get out. It was a camera store. I always wanted to work in a camera store, and went home and I did my homework, and that was totally voluntary. He didn't force me. I begged him to hire me for nothing, for no pay at all. Anyway, too bad we can't do that today. Today that guy would be serving a 20-year sentence. All right. Well, we're about out of time. I'll give you the last word. Dean?
Well, yeah, on that last story, I just want to touch on something because you learn skills at that job, even though you weren't making any money, that are so important. It's kind of like the ladder of economic success. When we put in a minimum wage, we cut out those bottom rungs, and folks can't get up there and get those good work habits and learning how to get along with other workers and listen to instructions from bosses and follow them. And it's basic skills, and we need a system where people can get that start rather than having to languish in poverty.
I heard Peter Schiff say recently, he said, I love robots or automation. He says, they don't sue you. That was a good point. I mean, he said it in sort of in jest, but he made a good point. Well, Dr. Dean Stansel, thank you so much for being on Liberty Talk Radio. We thoroughly enjoyed having you here, and thank you for your insights. We do hope that you will accept that invitation to return at a later date. Give us an update, and maybe we'll see how things have been transpiring.
Absolutely, Joe. Thanks so much for having me on. I'd love to come back.
Thank you so much. Folks, this is the end of today's broadcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support. We'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.